Before we get started, please make sure you like and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive. You might look at the paperback sitting on your nightstand or the e-reader charging on your desk right now and just see a story.
Right, a temporary escape.
Exactly, just a way to unwind.
Yeah.
But what if I told you that stack of bound paper or that digital file is the literal architectural blueprint of the human mind?
It sounds like a massive exaggeration, but it really isn't.
It's totally real. Today, we are opening up a fascinating new ebook. It's called Books, The Blueprint of Civilization by Conrad Riker. And for everyone listening, you can actually go grab this on Amazon Kindle or Google Playbooks right now.
Which I highly recommend doing.
Oh, absolutely. Definitely
Yeah.
do that after we finish here today. But yeah, this isn't your standard, dry, chronological history lesson.
No, not at all.
It's this incredible exploration of how the simple act of putting ink on paper literally designed human civilization. We are going to unpack the most mind-blowing insights from Riker's work today.
We're going everywhere from ancient dust-covered clay tablets in Sumeria all the way to the AI and virtual reality reading experiences of the future.
It's a wild ride.
It truly is a sweeping narrative. And to ground our conversation today, I think it's vital to establish the core premise of the book early on.
Yeah, lay it out for us.
When we examine the history of the written word, we aren't just looking at the evolution of paper or binding or distribution methods.
Right.
We are, quite literally, examining the history of human consciousness. The technology we use to record information fundamentally dictates how we process the world around us.
That is just such a massive concept to wrap your head around.
Yeah,
The idea that the physical medium actually changes the biological brain.
it does, physically alters it.
I know we're going to get super deep into the neuroscience of that later, but I want to start where the book starts. Because the sheer scale of the timeline here is breathtaking.
It really puts things in perspective.
Yeah. To understand how we got to carrying entire libraries in our pockets, we have to go back to the very dawn of the written word.
We do. And that takes us back roughly, about 6,400 years.
Wow.
Back to the Sumerians in the region of modern-day Iraq. This is where humanity invented the first recognizable form of writing, which we call cuneiform.
And reading about this in the source material, I was just struck by the sheer physical labor involved.
Oh, it was brutal.
Right. Like, they weren't sitting at mahogany desks with sleek fountain pens. They were taking literal sticks.
Carving them into wedge-shaped ends.
Yes, and pressing them into these heavy slabs of wet river clay.
Precisely. And the evolution of that script is incredibly revealing about human nature.
How so?
Well, cuneiform didn't begin as an alphabet to write poetry or philosophy. No one was writing novels.
Right, it wasn't for art.
No, it began out of pure logistical necessity. It started as a pictographic system, so literal rudimentary pictures of grain or sheep or cattle.
Like a spreadsheet.
Exactly. It was an
Wow.
accounting tool for administration and commerce.
Yeah.
But as those Sumerian city-states grew more complex,
With larger populations and trade networks?
right, their society outgrew simple pictures. You can't draw a complex legal contract with just pictures of sheep.
So the tool had to evolve to match the complexity of the civilization.
Exactly. The script took on a more abstract phonetic appearance. It shifted from just representing physical objects to representing actual sounds and concepts.
Which changes everything.
It allowed for the exchange of incredibly detailed, nuanced information. It was the birth of historical documenting. Suddenly, humanity wasn't relying solely on oral tradition.
Which we all know from playing a game of telephone, oral tradition is highly susceptible to distortion.
And just plain memory failure. But with clay, we could freeze a thought in time.
But the physical medium itself was kind of a nightmare for distribution. Riker highlights the sheer back-breaking weight of carrying those Sumerian clay tablets.
It wasn't practical.
Not at all. You couldn't exactly toss a clay tablet in your tote bag for the subway commute. A single heavy tablet might only contain the amount of information you'd find on a modern-day book page.
Imagine trying to transport an entire library of those.
You'd need a fleet of carts and oxen. It's absurd.
Which is why the next major technological leap was so critical.
Enter the Egyptians.
Right. Around 1800 BC, the ancient Egyptians discovered the properties of the papyrus plant.
Growing right there along the Nile.
Exactly. By harvesting this humble river reed, slicing it up and pressing it together, they created a writing surface that was lightweight, flexible, and easily transportable.
They conquered the barrier of portability.
They did, and on this papyrus, they developed hieroglyphs. But the author makes a really fascinating distinction here about how they viewed writing.
Yeah, hieroglyphs weren't just a utilitarian alphabet to them. They weren't just for spreadsheets.
No, they were deeply spiritual. They were viewed as actual vessels of divine wisdom.
Like magic, almost.
Yes, the Egyptians literally believed that the gods, specifically the god Thoth, gifted these symbols to humanity. So writing was a sacred act.
That's a huge shift from accounting.
And despite the fact that hieroglyphs were incredibly difficult to master, scribes had to memorize a massive catalog of characters. This new portable medium allowed the Egyptians to build a comprehensive, lasting record of their civilization.
From the monumental stone inscriptions down to private papyrus letters.
They documented everything. However, the scroll format, while lightweight, it still harbored a massive cognitive limitation.
I am so glad you brought this up because this was one of the biggest aha moments for me reading the deep dive material. I had never really thought about the actual physical mechanics of reading a scroll.
Right, because we don't do it anymore. It's a linear medium. Think about reading a long scroll of papyrus or parchment.
You have to unroll it sequentially with one hand while rolling it up with the other.
You are physically forced to consume the information exactly as it was written, from beginning to end.
Which is fine for a short story, but if you were studying a dense legal text or a philosophical argument,
And you want to check a fact from chapter 1 while you're reading chapter 10?
you can't just flip back. You have to physically, laboriously unroll the entire thing all the way back to the start.
Precisely. This structural limitation fundamentally bottlenecked how scholars and lawyers could interact with information.
It slowed down thought.
It really did. Which brings us to the 1st century AD, when the Romans popularized a revolutionary piece of technology, the Codex.
The Codex, which is essentially the physical format we all recognize today as a book.
Yes. Multiple individual pages, bound together on one side, housed between two protective covers.
And the book argues this transition from the scroll to the Codex is arguably one of the most important intellectual shifts in human history.
Because it wasn't merely a physical convenience. The Codex completely rewired how humans processed complex information.
Because it introduced random access.
Exactly. Random access.
Like random access memory in a computer. You can jump straight to the data you need without scrubbing through the entire hard drive.
Exactly. It facilitated cross-referencing. A scholar could hold their finger on a page in the middle of the book, flip to the index or an earlier chapter to verify a premise, and seamlessly return to their spot.
Just pop right back.
It allowed readers to compare texts side by side, structure their thoughts in nonlinear ways, and it fostered critical, analytical reading.
So the scroll was designed for recitation, but the Codex was designed for deep study.
That's the perfect way to phrase it.
It turned books from these scattered linear streams of information into cohesive, navigable architectures of knowledge. The physical evolution of the book led directly to the conceptual evolution of the texts they held.
Which is the perfect bridge into the next major theme of Riker's work.
Yeah, because once humanity had the Codex, they needed something profound to put in it.
They needed blueprints for living.
Right. And when people today are asked to name the most printed and widely read books in history, they usually guess wrong.
Oh, always. They default to modern assumptions. Maybe a blockbuster fantasy series like Harry Potter, or a massive contemporary thriller.
But the reality is that the most widely distributed texts in human history are ancient sacred texts. The Bible, the Quran, and the Torah.
And Riker's argument here is that these aren't just collections of ancient stories or spiritual guidelines. They are the literal architectural blueprints of our modern world.
Yeah, he says that even if you consider yourself entirely secular today, the society you walk around in every day was built on the scaffolding of these exact books.
Without question. Let's look at the societal impacts detailed in the text. Take the Bible, for example. The Ten Commandments didn't remain isolated as just spiritual advice for a specific group of people in antiquity.
No, they leaked into everything.
They profoundly, tangibly influenced the foundation of Western legal systems. Our modern secular laws against theft, perjury, and murder are directly rooted in the moral frameworks established by these texts.
I found the discussion on the eye for an eye concept particularly interesting. Because today we often use that phrase to describe, like, petty revenge.
Right, a tit-for-tat mentality.
Yeah, but historically it was a massive legal innovation.
It was a revolution in justice. Before frameworks like lex talionis, the law of retaliation, which we see in the Bible, and earlier in the Code of Hammurabi punishment, was often entirely disproportionate.
Meaning, if you stole a nobleman's goat, he might slaughter your entire family in retribution.
Exactly. The concept of an eye for an eye established an early framework for proportional punishment. The punishment could not exceed the crime,
It introduced a ceiling to retribution.
which is a core tenet of modern justice systems today. Furthermore, the underlying biblical emphasis on the inherent worth of the individual finds deep parallels in the fundamental concepts of modern democracy and human rights.
And shifting to the Quran, Riker points out how specific religious principles translated into massive societal structures. He highlights the principle of zakat.
Right. Zakat is an obligatory act of charity, considered one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It requires individuals who meet a certain threshold of wealth to give a specific percentage of their surplus wealth to those in need.
And what the author highlights is how this spiritual directive literally inspired and structured early social welfare systems in Muslim-majority regions.
It systematically shifted the societal focus away from pure individual accumulation to the collective well-being of the community.
It functioned as an early mechanism for wealth redistribution and social safety nets, which is incredible to think about. A book dictating tax policy, essentially.
And then you have the Torah, which Riker argues shaped social norms down to the very food we eat.
Kashrut.
Yes, Jewish dietary laws. Kashrut established deep-rooted food preparation methods, agricultural practices, and hygiene standards that have heavily influenced cultural and culinary history for millennia.
It's fascinating how a text can dictate the daily rhythm of life so completely. What you eat, how you wash your hands.
And beyond sacred texts, the book brings in the heavy hitters of philosophy. We're talking about texts that served as the intellectual cornerstones of Western thought. For instance, Plato's Republic.
Oh, we have to talk about the allegory of the cave. It's one of those concepts people reference all the time, but unpacking it in the context of why we read is so powerful.
It really is. The allegory of the cave is a brilliant illustration of enlightenment. Plato describes a group of people who have lived chained to the wall of a cave all their lives, facing a blank wall.
Right, they can't turn around.
They can't. And the people watch shadows projected on the wall from objects passing in front of a fire behind them. To these prisoners, the shadows are reality. It's all they've ever known.
They don't know there are 3D objects making the shadows.
Exactly. The philosopher is like a prisoner who is freed from the cave and comes to understand that the shadows on the wall are not reality at all, for he can perceive the true form of reality rather than the manufactured shadow.
And Riker's point is that a truly great book acts as the tool that breaks the chains.
That's it, exactly.
It forces the reader to turn around, look at the fire, and reevaluate their entire perception of reality.
Precisely. Then we have Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which introduced the concept of eudaimonia.
Which usually gets translated as happiness, right?
Often loosely translated that way, yes. But it's much better understood as human flourishing or peak human potential. Aristotle argued that this flourishing isn't achieved through fleeting pleasures, but through the cultivation of virtue over a lifetime.
He argued that your character, who you are, consistently matters far more than isolated actions.
And that framework still dominates massive sectors of moral philosophy and psychology today. It all traces back to that text.
And skipping ahead a few centuries, the book dives into René Descartes' meditations from the 17th century, the famous "I think, therefore I am."
Right. Descartes employed a method of radical skepticism. He wanted to find absolute, undeniable truth, so he decided to doubt everything he could possibly doubt.
He doubted his senses, his physical body, the world around him.
He even proposed that maybe it was all an illusion created by a deceitful demon. But he finally reached one bedrock conclusion. He could not doubt that he was doubting.
And if he was doubting, he must be thinking.
And if he was thinking, he must exist. Cogito, ergo sum. With those few words in a codex, he fundamentally questioned the foundations of human knowledge and paved the way for modern Western philosophy and the scientific method.
So we have this incredible lineage. Sacred texts and philosophical treatises that have united billions of people across centuries.
They've shaped our democracies, forged our legal systems, established our social welfare, and built our moral compasses.
But the book makes sure to address the darker reality here. There is a flip side to this much power resting in ink and paper.
It is an unavoidable historical reality. The dual nature of these texts is profound. While their timeless wisdom speaks to fundamental human experiences, offering a common language for morality and justice, they have also been heavily, repeatedly weaponized.
Because words are open to interpretation.
Exactly. Throughout history, the very same sacred texts that mandate charity and love have been misinterpreted, manipulated, and deliberately used by those in power for political gain.
To terrible ends.
They have been twisted to justify brutal wars of conquest, oppressive inquisitions, and horrific systemic discrimination against marginalized groups.
It really is a double-edged sword. Yeah. A text can inspire an individual to dedicate their entire life to serving the poor in Calcutta, while someone else uses that exact same text to justify subjugation.
The power of these books lies not just in the ancient words themselves, but in the interpretations and the authority we assign to those interpretations. The cultural and political lens through which society views these texts determines whether they act as tools for mass liberation or instruments of terrifying oppression.
Wow.
The blueprint can build a hospital or it can build a prison.
That is a chilling way to put it. A hospital or a prison. And that actually transitions us perfectly into the next major theme.
Right.
We've been talking about how texts shape society at a macro level, how they build laws, governments, cultures. But Riker's book points out that reading changes us at a micro level too, a literal biological level.
Yes. This takes us into the psychology and neuroscience of reading. And this is where the intersection of history and modern science becomes truly fascinating.
Because for a long time, the prevailing scientific consensus was that the adult human brain was relatively static.
Completely. The belief was that once you reached a certain age, your neural pathways were essentially set in stone. But modern neuroscience has introduced us to the concept of neuroplasticity.
Which is the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life.
Exactly. And the act of reading is apparently one of the most intense workouts you can give your brain to trigger this plasticity.
It's an incredibly complex cognitive process. When you read, your brain has to coordinate visual processing, language comprehension, memory retrieval, and abstract reasoning all simultaneously.
It's firing on all cylinders. Riker cites a remarkable study from the University of Oxford on this. Researchers used MRI scans to track brain development and found that the act of reading actually increases gray matter density in the left temporal cortex.
Let that sink in. So when people say reading makes you smarter, they aren't just being metaphorical. You are physically building gray matter in the area of the brain associated with understanding language and process meaning.
You are physically altering the architecture of your brain. It stimulates various regions, effectively rewiring the brain's connectivity to become more efficient. But the cognitive benefits don't stop at raw processing power or vocabulary.
Right, goes deeper.
Reading profoundly builds our emotional and social capacity.
The empathy aspect explored in the book just blew me away. It's one thing to say reading helps you understand people, but Riker brings in empirical data. He discusses a landmark study by psychologist David Conrad.
Yes, Kidd's research focused on how reading literary fiction impacts what psychologists call theory of mind.
Could you break down what theory of mind actually is for anyone listening who might not be familiar with the term?
Of course. Theory of mind is a foundational cognitive skill. It's our human ability to attribute mental states, so beliefs, intents, desires, emotions, knowledge, to ourselves and to others.
It's the understanding that the person sitting across from you has a completely different inner world, different background knowledge, and different feelings than you do.
Exactly. It is the core biological mechanism that allows for empathy and complex social navigation.
And Kidd's study proved that reading literary fiction acts like a flight simulator for this skill.
Precisely, a social simulator. When you read a richly developed novel, you are forced to step into the shoes of characters whose lives, motivations, and environments might be completely alien to your own.
You have to constantly track who knows what, who is lying, who is hurting, and why they are making the choices they are making.
And by practicing this in the safe, simulated environment of a book, you are literally training your brain's neural networks to be more attuned and empathetic to the complex mental states of real people in your daily life.
It proves that reading isn't just a leisurely escape from the world. It is a critical biological tool for social cognition. And this leads into a concept in the book that I absolutely loved: bibliotherapy.
Bibliotherapy. It's the deliberate use of books and reading as a therapeutic practice to support mental health and emotional well-being. It's been utilized in various forms for centuries, but modern psychology has formalized it.
And Riker uses Viktor Frankl's profound book, Man's Search for Meaning, as the ultimate case study for this. For context, Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist who survived the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps during the Holocaust.
Frankel observed human behavior in the most extreme, degrading, and agonizing conditions imaginable. In his book, he details those experiences, but he also uses them to articulate his psychological theory of logotherapy.
Logotherapy.
Yes, which proposes that the primary motivational force of an individual is to find a meaning in life. Even in the midst of unimaginable suffering, if a person can find a why to live for, they can endure almost any how.
And man's search for meaning has been prescribed in bibliotherapy for decades to help people who are grappling with severe trauma, depression, or existential dread. Because if Frankl could find purpose in Auschwitz, the reader is guided to find meaning in their own suffering. The book becomes a literal lifeline.
It does. And the author shares another historical anecdote that perfectly illustrates this transformative power. He details the life of Malcolm X, specifically his time spent in prison in his 20s.
This is such a powerful story. Malcolm X enters prison essentially as a street hustler with a very limited formal education. But while incarcerated, he undergoes an intellectual and spiritual metamorphosis, and it was entirely driven by reading.
He essentially locked himself in the prison library. He painstakingly copied the entire dictionary page by page to build his vocabulary and improve his penmanship.
Page by page.
Once he had the vocabulary, he began devouring books on history, philosophy, and religion. It is a stark, undeniable proof that books are active, potent agents of profound personal change.
They allow an individual to transcend their physical surroundings, no matter how bleak, and entirely reconstruct their identity and intellect.
Books heal trauma, they build empathy, and according to another study Riker cites, they even protect our cognitive future. He looks at research from the University of Stavanger in Norway, which tracked adults over a 4-year period.
And the findings were very clear, right? There is a direct, robust link between regular reading and long-term memory retention.
Very direct. The adults who engaged in consistent reading retained significantly better memory recall and cognitive function than non-readers. The mental gymnastics required to follow long narratives, track multiple characters, and digest new vocabulary keeps the neural pathways robust, acting as a buffer against cognitive decline.
So on an individual level, books rewire our brains, increase our empathy, help us survive trauma, and protect our memory. It's incredible. But if reading can alter the biology of a single human brain so profoundly, what happens when you scale that effect up to millions of people simultaneously?
That is the pivotal question, and it transitions us from the science of the individual brain to the science of mass movements, how books and stories have historically acted as catalysts for massive social revolution.
To understand why a story can start a revolution, Riker argues we have to understand our neurological craving for narrative. We aren't just logically convinced by facts, we are biologically addicted to stories.
Our brains are fundamentally wired to organize information into narratives. When we are presented with a list of dry facts, only the language processing parts of our brain activate. But when we hear a well-structured story, our brain lights up like a pinball machine.
Everything turns on.
Motor cortexes, sensory cortexes, and emotional centers all engage. Most importantly, a compelling narrative triggers the release of dopamine, a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure, reward, and memory reinforcement.
So a great story essentially drugs us. It makes the information we are consuming feel deeply rewarding and impossible to forget.
Exactly. And the most effective communicators in history have understood this implicitly long before we had MRI machines to prove it. The ancient Greeks formalized the mechanics of this persuasion. Aristotle, in his work Rhetoric, broke down the tools of persuasion into 3 essential pillars.
Ethos, logos, and pathos.
Yes.
For those of us who haven't taken a rhetoric class in a while, let's break those down. Ethos is the credibility of the speaker. Why should we trust you? Do you have the moral authority or the expertise to speak on this subject?
Correct. Logos is the appeal to logic and reason. Does the argument make rational sense? Is it supported by data, evidence, and a sound premise?
And finally, pathos, the appeal to emotion. Does the speaker or writer make us feel something? Do they ignite our anger, our sorrow, or our hope?
And Riker's point is that a narrative only achieves world-changing power when it masterfully combines all 3. He uses Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech as a modern masterclass in this triad.
Oh, it's the perfect example.
Dr. King possessed undeniable ethos as a dedicated frontline leader of the civil rights movement. He utilized logos by meticulously pointing out the unfulfilled legal and moral promises of the American Constitution and the Emancipation Proclamation.
But it was the pathos that made it immortal. His vivid, emotional imagery of a future where children are judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. It stirred the deepest emotional resonance in millions of people.
It was a perfectly calibrated narrative weapon that drove the civil rights movement forward.
And when we look specifically at literature, the historical impact of the right narrative at the right time is staggering. Riker lists books that essentially functioned as literary Molotov cocktails.
Yes, let's look at some of these because it really puts the power of publishing into perspective. In the 18th century, you have works like Voltaire's Candide and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract.
Rousseau famously wrote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains."
Those works provided the intellectual and emotional scaffolding that directly fueled the anti-monarchical fires of the French Revolution. They gave the populace the language to articulate their oppression.
Then, in the 19th century, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto.
A relatively short pamphlet that provided the ideological blueprint that would eventually lead to the Bolshevik Revolution, the rise of the Soviet Union, and fundamentally alter global geopolitics for the entire 20th century.
And speaking of the 20th century, George Orwell's 1984, a novel that gave us the vocabulary to recognize and resist totalitarianism. Words like Big Brother, thought crime, and doublethink are now permanent fixtures in our political discourse.
And returning to the 19th century United States, we cannot understate the impact of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Published in 1852, it humanized the brutal, horrific realities of slavery to a northern public that had largely been insulated from its day-to-day atrocities.
It was so deeply saturated with pathos that it is widely credited with accelerating the intense moral outrage that precipitated the U.S. Civil War.
Yeah.
The legend goes that when Abraham Lincoln met Sco, he said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war."
Even in modern times, literature continues to shape the physical world. In 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, exposing the devastating environmental impacts of indiscriminate pesticide use.
The narrative was so compelling and scientifically sound that it literally launched the modern environmental movement and led to the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency.
Now, what's truly fascinating here and a bit unsettling is a paradox that Riker explores deeply in this section. Narratives possess such immense psychological power that they don't even have to be 100% factually accurate to change the world.
Right. This part of the book blew my mind. The idea that fiction can sometimes force factual change more effectively than actual data. Let's unpack the example he uses. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle.
Upton Sinclair published The Jungle in 1906. It is crucial to remember that it was a work of fiction. Sinclair was an ardent socialist, and his primary explicit goal in writing the novel was to highlight the crushing economic plight, the wage slavery, and the exploitation of immigrant workers in the Chicago meatpacking industry.
He wanted to spark a labor revolution.
He wanted the public to care about the workers, but that is not what happened.
Not at all.
Sinclair included incredibly graphic, stomach-turning descriptions of the unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking plants, diseased animals, rat infestations, and even workers falling into rendering vats.
Which is horrifying.
The public largely ignored the socialist message about worker exploitation, but they were absolutely horrified by what was going into their breakfast sausage.
Sinclair famously lamented, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach."
The visceral emotional resonance of the story, the pathos of disgust and fear, completely overpowered the political intent. But the narrative was so potent that it inadvertently birthed massive federal regulatory changes, leading directly to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act.
It is a wild paradox. The fictional story failed its intended goal to save the workers, but the emotional payload was so strong it ended up saving the consumers.
Exactly.
But, as Riker points out, this paradox reveals a profound vulnerability in human psychology. If stories have the power to bypass logic, to liberate and reform, they equally possess the dark power to bypass logic, to suppress and manipulate.
Which brings us to a much heavier but entirely necessary part of the historical blueprint, the dark side of narratives and the continuous fight for free speech. Because narratives shape perceptions and drive massive group behaviors, they are the ultimate tool for propaganda.
The book section on World War II illustrates this terrifyingly well. The Nazi regime didn't just conquer through military might, they conquered through the meticulous control of narrative.
The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, masterfully and malevolently utilized radio, film, and print to saturate the German populace with anti-Semitic narratives.
And again, they didn't rely on logical data.
No, they relied entirely on fabricated pathos, stoking fear, resentment, and a false sense of victimhood. By controlling the stories the public consumed, they successfully manipulated an entire nation toward complicity in unspeakable horrors.
And Riker gives an American example that is just as stark.
Yeah.
The 1915 silent film, The Birth of a Nation.
Directed by D.W. Griffith, this film was a massive cinematic achievement of its time, but its narrative was profoundly toxic. It presented a highly distorted, racist, historical revisionism of the Reconstruction era, painting the Ku Klux Klan as heroic saviors of a supposedly besieged white South.
And the Klan was largely defunct at that time, right? Like, it was mostly gone.
It was essentially dead. But the narrative power of that film was so effective, so emotionally manipulative, that it directly resulted in a massive nationwide resurgence of Klan membership and a subsequent wave of horrific white supremacist violence. A fictional narrative resurrected a real-world terror group.
And we are not immune to this today. The technology has changed, but our brains haven't. Riker brings up the modern phenomenon of the Pizzagate conspiracy theory.
Pizzagate is a textbook example of how a fabricated narrative can bypass logic and incite real-world action in the digital age. It was a completely baseless conspiracy theory that originated on internet message boards, spreading false accusations that high-ranking political figures were running a child sex trafficking ring out of the basement of a Washington, D.C. pizzeria.
A pizzeria that didn't even have a basement.
Exactly. There is zero concrete, logical evidence, no logos whatsoever. But the pathos, the primal emotional outrage over the alleged abuse of children, was so potent that the narrative went viral. It culminated in a man driving to the restaurant armed with an assault rifle and firing a weapon inside, fully believing he was the hero of the story.
It perfectly illustrates why those in power and those who fear the disruption of society have spent centuries trying to control narratives through censorship. If a book or a story can start a war or dismantle a government, the natural reflex of authority is to ban the book.
And the history of institutional censorship is incredibly long and dark. The overarching theme is always the suppression of ideas that threaten the established orthodoxy. Look at the Roman Inquisition, a system of tribunals developed by the Holy See. Scholars and authors who dared to publish works that contradicted church doctrines suffered severe consequences, ranging from imprisonment to execution.
Riker specifically highlights the Index Librorum Prohibitorum,
The list of prohibited books, maintained by the Catholic Church from the 16th century all the way until 1966. This wasn't just a list of theological disagreements. The Church systematically banned groundbreaking scientific treatises and philosophical works.
The book makes a massive claim here, that this specific act of censorship contributed significantly to the prolongation of the Dark Ages and stifled human progress. Can we unpack how exactly that worked?
Certainly. Consider the heliocentric model of the universe, the idea that the Earth revolves around the sun. Nicholas Copernicus published this theory, and later, Galilei provided observational evidence for it. Because this directly contradicted the Church's literal interpretation of Scripture at the time, their works were banned, and Galileo was placed under house arrest.
So they just shut it down.
When you systematically ban the foundational texts of physics, astronomy, and biology, you physically halt human progress. Scholars across Europe were terrified to build upon these ideas or publish their own findings. The flow of scientific information was dammed up by censorship.
And moving into the 20th century, we see secular totalitarian regimes utilizing the exact same playbook. Riker discusses China's Cultural Revolution under Mao Zedong in the 1960s and 70s.
The state mobilized the Red Guards to destroy the Four Olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. This resulted in the massive, systemic burning of historical texts, the destruction of ancient artifacts, and the violent persecution of intellectuals, teachers, and scholars.
Trying to reset year zero.
They attempted to erase the past to enforce a pure, unchallenged state ideology. Though, as Riker noted with a touch of irony, this intense suppression actually led to the rapid growth of underground, subversive movements such as the Underground Church.
The human desire for unauthorized ideas always seems to find a crack in the pavement. And then you have Stalin in the Soviet Union. This is perhaps the most literal form of censorship imaginable. Stalin didn't just ban books. He literally had his political rivals, like Leon Trotsky, airbrushed and erased from official photographic records.
It is literal historical revisionism. If you can control the visual and textual records of the past, you can dictate the reality of the present and control the future.
Which brings us to a really uncomfortable but vital discussion about the present day. We tend to look back at the Inquisition or book burnings and think of censorship as a barbaric relic of the past. We live in democracies. We have the internet. But Riker argues that modern free speech challenges are far more insidious because they are invisible.
In the modern digital landscape, the explicit freedom of speech is largely championed, at least in Western democracies. The government isn't burning books in the town square, but we are facing entirely new, highly sophisticated forms of suppression. The gatekeepers have simply changed their methods.
And this is where Riker dives into the concept of algorithm-driven echo chambers. I think everyone intuitively feels this happening to them, but seeing it laid out is wild.
The algorithms that power our social media feeds, our video platforms, and our search engines are not designed to prioritize truth, nuance, or intellectual growth. They're designed to optimize for one metric: engagement.
They want to keep your eyes on the screen as long as possible to serve you ads.
And how do they do that? By feeding us exactly what we already believe.
Exactly. The algorithm learns your preferences, your political leanings, and your biases. It then tailors your entire internet experience to reflect those biases back at you. In doing so, it inadvertently but effectively censors the internet for you by siloing you into an echo chamber. You are rarely, if ever, presented with high-quality counter-arguments to your deeply held beliefs.
So instead of a pope or a dictator banning a book so you can't read it, a string of computer code is quietly hiding opposing viewpoints from your feed so you never even know they exist. It isolates us, making us more polarized and certain of our own righteousness. It stunts our intellectual growth just as effectively as a physical book burning would, but we willingly participate in it.
Add to that the complex dynamics of cancel culture. In an environment of hyper-visibility on social media, individuals often engage in intense self-censorship out of a very real fear of public shaming, social ostracization, or losing their livelihoods for expressing an unpopular opinion. The chilling effect on open discourse is profound.
Furthermore, the platforms themselves have become the new censors. Riker points out how massive tech monopolies like Amazon, which controls a staggering percentage of the global book market, have at times selectively removed books they deem offensive or inappropriate according to their own opaque corporate guidelines.
If a book is removed from Amazon, it is essentially vanished from the public square.
And we also continue to see deadly real-world collisions between free speech and deep-seated religious sensibilities in the modern era. The book highlights the 2005 Danish cartoons controversy, where a newspaper published satirical depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, sparking global protests, boycotts, and fatal violence.
And the infamous fatwa issued against the author Salman Rushdie.
Yes, in 1989, the supreme leader of Iran issued a fatwa calling for the assassination of Salman Rushdie following the publication of his novel The Satanic Verses, which was deemed blasphemous. Rushdie was forced into hiding for years, his translators were attacked, and even decades later, he suffered a horrific physical assault on stage. It highlights the incredibly volatile friction point of our globalized civilization, striking a balance between respecting deeply held cultural sensibilities and protecting a vibrant, unrestricted, pluralistic public sphere.
It's a heavy challenge. Historically, the only way humanity has ever overcome the urge of the powerful to censor and control information is to invent technology that produces information faster than it can be suppressed.
The printing press.
We're entering the mid-15th century, which represents a tectonic shift in the trajectory of human history. Enter Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith from Mainz, Germany.
Before Gutenberg, if you wanted a book, say a Bible, how did you get one?
You couldn't, right? Unless you were incredibly wealthy or part of the clergy. Books were painstakingly, manually hand-copied by scribes and monks in scriptoriums. A single Bible could take a monk years to transcribe. The materials were expensive, the labor was immense, and the resulting books were so rare and valuable they were often literally chained to the library shelves to prevent theft.
So knowledge was inherently elitist. It was locked away.
Entirely. But Gutenberg adapted existing technologies. The agricultural screw press used for making wine, combined with his metallurgical expertise to cast durable metal movable type. He created a system where letters could be arranged, inked, and pressed onto paper rapidly and repeatedly.
He didn't just invent a machine, he democratized knowledge.
He shattered the monopoly on information. The printing press drastically reduced the cost and time required to produce books. Ideas could now spread like wildfire. Riker argues convincingly that the printing press was the primary catalyst for the major intellectual movements that followed.
He ties it directly to the scientific revolution and the Renaissance.
Absolutely. The groundbreaking astronomical works of Copernicus, or Galileo's observations of the moons of Jupiter, could now be printed and distributed across Europe faster than the Inquisition could track them down. Scientists could share their data, replicate experiments, and build upon each other's work across borders.
It fueled the Enlightenment, giving philosophers a massive audience, and it was the engine of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther's 95 Theses went viral because of the printing press.
From that singular invention, an entire industry ecosystem evolved rapidly. The book traces this evolution beautifully. By the 19th century, you have the rise of major publishing houses like Random House. They began capitalizing on a growing middle class and rising literacy rates, treating books not just as scholarly tools, but as consumer goods. They fed the public's hunger for reading.
And the 20th century brought further democratization with the invention of the mass market paperback. We see imprints like Penguin Classics emerge.
I love the story of the paperback. The idea was to make great literature incredibly cheap. Cheap enough that a working class person could buy a copy of Homer or Shakespeare at a train station newsstand for the price of a pack of cigarettes, read it on their commute, and leave it on the seat for the next person. It completely removed the financial barrier to classic literature.
But as Riker rightly points out, we cannot comprehensively discuss the ecosystem of books without discussing the crucial institutions designed to house and protect them. Libraries.
The history of libraries is a fascinating parallel journey, from extreme exclusivity to mass democratization.
It is. If we go back to around 2600 BCE, we see Ashurbanipal's massive collection of clay tablets in Nineveh, an intellectual hub of the Assyrian Empire. Later, the legendary Great Library of Alexandria in Egypt served as a massive, unparalleled research center for the ancient world, attempting to collect all the world's knowledge.
But those ancient libraries weren't exactly open to the public, right? You couldn't just walk in and get a library card.
Not at all. They were highly exclusive, restricted to the societal elite, royalty, or high priests. Even moving into the Middle Ages, the great libraries were housed deep within monastic centers. Riker uses the example of Mont Saint-Michel in France. Generations of monks dedicated their entire lives to preserving and copying classical texts by Plato, Aristotle, and early Christian theologians. They saved Western knowledge from fading into obscurity, but access to that knowledge was strictly restricted to the clergy.
It wasn't until the Renaissance that we finally saw a shift toward the concept of public secular libraries.
A prime example is the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice, founded in the 15th century. Sponsored by the Venetian state itself, it was intentionally built not just for the elite, but to diffuse culture and knowledge among the broader citizenry. It was an early recognition that a well-read public is beneficial to the state.
And as this entire ecosystem, the printing presses, the publishing houses, the libraries, grew into a massive global industry, the role of the publisher fundamentally shifted. This is a crucial insight from Riker's text that really reframes how we think about the modern book world.
For centuries, from the days of Gutenberg right up until the late 20th century, publishers held absolute power. They were the ultimate gatekeepers of the printing press. Because the physical production and distribution of books was so expensive, publishers alone decided what ideas were worthy of public consumption and financial investment. If a publisher rejected your manuscript, your ideas essentially did not exist to the public.
But the internet, and specifically platforms like Amazon and direct self-publishing tools, shattered that gatekeeper model entirely.
Completely. Today, the cost of production and distribution has dropped effectively to zero. Anyone with a laptop and an internet connection can format a manuscript and publish it globally to millions of potential readers within 24 hours.
So if the publishers are no longer the gatekeepers, what is their purpose today?
Riker argues they have had to fundamentally transition from being gatekeepers to becoming curators. Because the floodgates are open, readers are now drowning in an overwhelming ocean of content. Millions of new titles published every year. The role of the modern publisher, or the modern literary agent, is to act as a trusted curator, sifting through the noise to find, polish, and elevate truly superior, culturally relevant work, helping readers navigate the chaos.
I love that distinction, gatekeepers to curators. And before we move past the global ecosystem, Riker takes a moment to highlight the unsung hero of this entire endeavor, translation.
It is a critical point. Without translation, humanity would remain siloed in isolated, regional pockets of knowledge. Riker points to the historical discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which featured the same decree written in 3 scripts, including ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and ancient Greek. It provided the key that finally allowed modern scholars to unlock, translate, and understand thousands of years of ancient Egyptian literature and history that had been previously lost to time. Translators build the intellectual bridges that allow ideas to cross borders and centuries.
Okay, so the printing press was the first major technological leap for books. It defined reading for half a millennium. But right now, we are currently living through a total unprecedented paradigm shift. The move from ink 2 pixels.
We are in the midst of the digital paradigm, and the defining entity of this era, as Riker details, is Amazon.
It's easy to forget that when Amazon launched in 1994, it wasn't the everything store. It was just a humble online bookstore operating out of a garage. But they completely optimized the supply chain of physical books. However, it was their launch of the Kindle in 2007 that changed the world overnight.
The Kindle, with its e-ink display and ability to instantly download a book over cellular networks, revolutionized ebook consumption. It solved the physical constraints of the codex just as the codex solved the constraints of the scroll. You could now carry thousands of books in a device lighter than a single paperback.
But what is absolutely fascinating and a bit comforting to traditionalists are the statistics Riker provides regarding the market today. Despite the massive disruption and convenience of digital formats, the physical paper book has proven incredibly resilient. It hasn't been eradicated the way MP3s eradicated CDs.
The data is surprising to many tech prognosticators. In 2021, ebooks accounted for roughly 20% of total book sales. Meanwhile, print books maintained a massive, dominant 80% share of the market.
Why do you think that is? I know the book touches on it, but why are we so attached to the paper?
Riker attributes it to the tactile, sensory experience of reading. Humans are physical creatures. The act of holding a book, feeling the weight of the paper, physically turning the page, and seeing your spatial progress through the text anchors the reading experience in our bodies. There's also a strong psychological component. A physical bookshelf acts as a visible identity marker and a record of one's intellectual journey in a way that a digital library on a screen simply cannot replicate.
You can't deny the aesthetic pleasure of a good bookshelf. However, the digital shift extends far beyond screens. It has moved into our ears. The explosion of audiobooks and podcasts over the last decade is staggering. Riker notes a statistic that blew my mind. In 2019, 40% of Americans over the age of 12 had listened to an audiobook.
40% is a massive cultural adoption rate. The audio format caters perfectly to the demands of our busy, modern lives, facilitating multitasking, allowing people to consume literature while commuting, exercising, or doing chores.
But Riker makes a point to highlight that audiobooks aren't just about convenience, they are about profound accessibility.
Yes, for the estimated 7 million legally blind Americans and millions more with visual impairments or learning disabilities like dyslexia, the rise of affordable, easily accessible audiobooks has been revolutionary. It has removed a massive barrier to literature and education, providing an inclusive way to experience the written word that was previously highly restricted or dependent on expensive Braille materials.
And then you throw social media into the literary mix. Reading used to be viewed as a highly solitary, quiet activity, you and the book in a room. Now, platforms like Goodreads have over 125 million members tracking their reading, rating books, and writing reviews.
And visually driven platforms have birthed entire subcultures, like Bookstagram on Instagram or Book Talk on TikTok, where readers share gorgeous, curated photos and passionate video reviews of their favorite novels. It has effectively created a massive, highly engaged global book club.
And this social media ecosystem has finalized the democratization of publishing we talked about earlier. Authors no longer need to wait for a traditional publisher in New York to anoint them with a book deal.
Riker uses two highly illustrative examples of this phenomenon, E.L. James with 50 Shades of Grey and James Dashner with The Maze Runner. Both of these incredibly successful authors initially bypassed traditional gatekeepers entirely. They leveraged the internet, serialized their work on fan fiction forums, engaged directly with online communities, and utilized social media to build massive, rabid fan bases. The traditional publishers only stepped in after the authors had already proven the massive market demand. They launched global careers entirely on their own terms.
It really is an incredible, liberating time to be a reader and a writer. The barriers are gone. But as we look at the current state of reading, staring at screens, swiping on e-readers, and listening through wireless headphones, we have to ask the ultimate question. What does the future hold for the actual reality we read in? This brings us to the final and perhaps most mind-bending section of Riker's book, Predicting the Future, AI, VR, and beyond.
We are standing right now on the frontier of a totally new literary landscape. The integration of artificial intelligence and virtual reality is poised to redefine not just the publishing industry, but the very definition of what a book is.
Let's start with AI, because it's the buzzword of the decade. How is AI currently being used in the book world today, not in some distant sci-fi future?
It is already deeply integrated into the back end of the industry. Publishers are utilizing AI to analyze vast, complex data sets of consumer reading habits to develop hyper-targeted marketing campaigns. AI algorithms are being used to assist in the tedious work of copy editing and formatting manuscripts. More controversially, we are seeing the rise of AI co-authoring tools, where writers use large language models to brainstorm plots, overcome writer's block, or rapidly generate preliminary drafts of genre fiction. The AI is becoming an active participant in the creation of the narrative.
But the VR reading experiences, this part of the book reads straight out of a science fiction novel. Riker introduces companies like Tiltbrush that are experimenting with spatial computing and narrative.
The implications of augmented reality and virtual reality in reading are profound. Currently, there are legitimate barriers to widespread adoption, primarily the high cost of the hardware, the bulky nature of VR headsets, and the physical discomfort or motion sickness some users experience. But Riker asks us to look past the current hardware limitations and imagine the inevitable possibilities of the medium.
He uses a great, highly relatable analogy for AR in education.
He points out that just a few years ago, millions of children used augmented reality to catch digital Pikachus in their real world backyards with the game Pokemon Go. It normalized the technology. In the near future, students won't just read a flat 2D description of ancient architecture and history textbook. They will point their tablet or their AR glasses at the page, and a fully rendered interactive 3D model of the Egyptian pyramids will rise right out of the book. They can rotate it, explore the internal chambers, and visualize the scale in a way a flat image could never convey.
And when you apply that to fiction, it completely blurs the line between reading a story and living it.
Imagine putting on a lightweight headset. Instead of merely reading words on a page describing the English countryside, you physically walk alongside Elizabeth Bennet through the lush, perfectly rendered estates of Pride and Prejudice. You hear the rustling leaves, you feel the atmospheric lighting, you see the expressions on the characters' faces.
Or, if you want something darker, you step directly inside the terrifying, gloomy, echoey halls of Dracula's castle. You become an active spatial participant in the narrative.
Exactly. It transitions reading from a purely internal, imaginative, cognitive process into an external, immersive sensory experience. It could completely redefine the definition of literature in the 21st century.
It is absolutely mind-blowing to consider the trajectory. To quickly summarize the incredible path we've taken today, we started over 6,000 years ago with scribes pressing wedge-shaped sticks into wet mud in Sumeria. We explored how the Romans rewired human cognition by inventing the Codex. We discussed the monumental world-building impact of sacred and philosophical texts and how they can be weaponized. We dove into the literal neuroscience of empathy and brain plasticity. We saw how stories spark revolutions from the French to the Civil War, traced the democratization of knowledge through Gutenberg's press and public libraries, and finally looked at our digital present and our wild virtual reality future.
It is a vast, complex, and beautiful blueprint. But before we conclude, exploring this trajectory raises one final, highly important question for you to ponder.
Lay it on us.
We established earlier, through empirical science, that the act of reading physical books increases our gray matter, builds deep cognitive empathy through theory of mind, and strengthens our biological memory networks. It requires intense cognitive effort. So, what happens to human evolution if we fully outsource our reading, our remembering, and our storytelling to artificial intelligence algorithms and immersive, pre-rendered virtual realities? If the machine visualizes the story for us and the AI writes the narrative, do our imaginative muscles atrophy? Will we gain a universe of instantaneous information and breathtaking entertainment, but slowly lose the very mental architecture that makes us distinctly human?
Wow, that is an incredibly heavy, provocative thought to leave on. Will the very technology that contains all of our accumulated knowledge eventually replace our biological capacity to think deeply about it? Incredible. For everyone listening, if you want to understand the very foundation of human civilization, you need to dive into this material yourself. Check out books The Blueprint of Civilization by Conrad Riker. You can grab your copy right now on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books. Also, be sure to follow the author for more incredible insights at Conrad Riker on Substack. And when you finish the book, make sure to follow the author's request and leave a glowing 5-star review. Finally, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our show so we can keep bringing you these deep dives. See you next time.